To the sentencing of Wayne Couzens. This is the ex-Metropolitan Police officer who raped and murdered Sarah Everard. He was indecently exposing himself before that date. That is what is being sentenced for today by Mrs Justice May.
Today will not affect that whole life term. Given the sexual nature of the present offences, notification is automatic. That, too, is academic. A surcharge order will apply in the ordinary way. But sentencing also serves as a public recognition of the fact that offences have been committed, to note the impact upon the victim or victims, and where appropriate, to mark with gratitude their courage and resilience in reporting the offences, giving statements about what happened to them, and being prepared to follow through by giving evidence at any trial. Without that persistence and fortitude by members of the public who've been offended against, justice could not happen. As victims of a sexual offence, each of the women are entitled to anonymity for their lifetimes. I shall refer to them as A, B, and C. Each of them is to be commended for reporting and following through. The first of the offences in time involved A, who was cycling up a narrow country lane between Deal and Dover on the 13th of November 2020 at around 2:30 in the afternoon. Photographs of the lane in question show that it has a banked verge up one side with some woodland at the top. As A cycled up, a man stepped out from the trees.
We're just going to step back from the audio of this feed for the time being, just due to the nature of some of the revelations that are being heard. This is about Wayne Couzens, who was exposing himself to women. He'd exposed himself 3 times to women that is known about before he kidnapped, raped and murdered Sarah Everard. This is the sentencing that is happening place at the moment by Mrs Justice May, but she is giving some of the details of some of the exposures, and they are rather graphic, so we're not able to bring them to you on daytime TV. He is 50, Wayne Couzens, and is already serving a whole life jail sentence for her murder. And these indecent exposure, these flashing incidents took place in Woodland and also at a fast food restaurant in Kent. And they took place between November 2020 and February 2021, the last incident happening just a few days before he then went on to kidnap, rape and murder Sarah Everard. Well, he has appeared at the Old Bailey via video link from where he is being held in prison, at Franklin Prison, for this sentencing. Opening the facts, we've heard that he exposed himself to female cyclist near Dover in November the 13th, 2020. That is the first charge. She is being called Victim A. At the time that he did this, he was on duty and was supposed to be working from home in Deal at the time. And also the court was told that that incident in particular happened on an isolated, narrow rural lane which ran inland between Deal and Dover. And this was actually just a few miles from where the defendant took Miss Everard after he kidnapped her and after he'd moved her from one vehicle to another. So it's clearly an area that he was very familiar with. And he stepped out of the woods and exposed himself to a female cyclist. We're able to return to the sentencing by Mrs Justice May.
Taken 3 days later on the 3rd of March 2021. The victim personal statements of A, B and C, read in court just now, speak justly of their shock and upset at this defendant's selfish, sexually aggressive acts. All have spoken of their sense of freedom and security taken from them, of feeling vulnerable and fearful for themselves and others going about their ordinary lives. One woman, after discovering who had done this and what he had gone on to do, speaks of a wholly understandable sense of survivor's guilt. The fact that no police came to find him or his black car to question him about these incidents can only have served to confirm and strengthen in the defendant's mind a dangerous belief in his invincibility, in his power sexually to dominate and abuse women without being stopped. In arriving at sentence, I have had regard to the Sentencing Council guideline for the offence of exposure, the guideline on totality and the guideline on reduction in sentence for a guilty plea. The statutory maximum sentence for the offence.
Well, due to the extreme language that we are about to hear from Mrs Justice May, who is sentencing Wayne Couzens for 3 counts of exposure, we are going to step away from the audio feed at the moment from the Old Bailey. Just to remind you what we're listening to, this is the sentencing of Wayne Couzens. Now, he has already been found guilty and is already serving a whole life sentence in jail for the kidnap, rape and murder of Sarah Everard. But these are for events that happened before he did this. He has been found guilty already of exposing himself to a female cyclist and also exposing himself twice when he went to a drive-through fast food restaurant to the women who worked there. These events were not investigated by the police, despite the fact that they were all reported to the police at the time. And indeed, in the case of the drive-through, the women who were there had both his registration number and his credit card details, which they gave to the police. But they were not investigated, and he went on to kidnap, rape and murder Sarah Everard. Let's listen back into the sentencing.
The guilty pleas entered on the 13th of February. I take into account that this was the first time the defendant was arraigned on the second indictment. However, it was by no means the earliest occasion on which he could have indicated a guilty plea. The defendant is attending via a link from his prison. He's to stay seated where he is. For the offence against A, count 2 on indictment number T 2022-0638, the sentence is one of 19 months imprisonment. There will be concurrent sentences of 6 months on each of counts 2 and 3 on indictment T 2022-0320. The total sentence is accordingly one of 19 months. As I have already said.
So let's just remind you what we are listening into. This is the sentencing of Wayne Couzens for indecent exposure. This is the former police officer that killed Sarah Everard. Before he carried this out, he had exposed himself a number of times to women, and this is what he is now being tried, found guilty of, but it's the sentencing that we are hearing now from Mrs Justice May. Because of the nature of what he did, these sexual exposures that he made to women, some of the content we can't bring you, unfortunately, on daytime TV, so we are dipping the sound when it is inappropriate to do so. But the court has heard that he exposed himself 3 times that is known about, 3 times that were reported to police. Once to a female cyclist who was cycling on her own through a wooded area. He was fully naked when he exposed himself to her. And twice to women working in fast food restaurants who handed him food and then saw that he was exposing himself in the car as they handed over the food. Now, in the case of all of these, the lady on the bike reported it to police and told other people who were in the woods at the time. Also, the 2 fast food workers reported it to police along with his licence plate and his name and credit card details. But no action was taken by the police. We've heard Mrs Justice May saying that these victims felt shock at his aggressive exposure. And the fact that no police came to find him can only have served to increase his belief that his ability to dominate women without being caught. And now on the first count, count A, he has been sentenced to 19 months in prison, then 2 concurrent sentences of 6 months for counts 2 and 3. This is after he admitted these 3 incidents of indecent exposure committed in the months before he kidnapped, raped and murdered Sarah Everard. Worth reminding that the last exposure was just a matter of days before he went on to kidnap, rape and murder Sarah Everard. And many people who study violent patterns of behaviour have said that there are links between those who expose themselves sexually to people who then tend to go on and commit more serious violent acts later. So we've heard that Mrs Justice May has sentenced Wayne Couzens to 19 months in prison after his admission of 3 incidents of indecent exposure committed in the months before he kidnapped, raped and murdered Sarah Everard. He is serving already a whole life jail sentence up in Franklin Jail in the North East for her murder. but this will be added to that sentence. So the sentencing now happening at the Old Bailey. We're able to bring you some elements of it live, but unfortunately because of the sexual nature of some of it, we have to step away from the feed when it is too explicit. These incidents happened not far from where he was based. The incident in the woods when he exposed himself to a cyclist happened on an isolated lane between Deal and Dover, and this was only a few miles from where he took Miss Everard, having kidnapped her, moving her from one vehicle to another at the time. Now, the lady that he exposed himself then to was really shocked. She met some other women further in the wood, told them what had happened, went home, told her family, and then reported it to the police, and also reported the car that she had seen, which was his car, but because she didn't have a number plate, the investigation stalled at the time. But she then contacted the police again after she saw his image after the murder of Sarah Everard, and she knew that it was the same person, and they were able to link the two. He was meant to be working at home at the time, and then the other incidents were at a drive-through fast food restaurant in Kent. The female staff there, after he exposed himself, were left shaken, upset and angry. Now, he used his own credit card to pay for his meal there, and also the automatic number plate recognition service and cell site data was used to track his car in the area at the time of the incidents. But this was, of course, only done retrospectively after he had murdered Sarah Everard. The hearing there has finished, and we are expecting reaction from the Crown Prosecution Service and the Metropolitan Police as well. Many women's rights campaigners will say that they have questions to answer about why these crimes were not investigated when they had clear evidence that could have led him to this person carrying out these crimes and could potentially have stopped the kidnap, rape and murder of Sarah Everard. And indeed, one of the victims in the court has told the court how she has real guilt and remorse, that had she not been able to do more to identify him, it could have stopped this pattern of behaviour. So we are expecting to get response to what has happened. He has denied other indecent exposure allegations, incidentally, but we will bring you more on the judge's comments, and we will bring you more reaction to this sentencing at the Old Bailey when we are able to a little later today. Well, just remind you, former Metropolitan Police officer Wayne Couzens has been sentenced to 19 months in prison at the Old Bailey after admitting 3 incidents of indecent exposure committed in the months before he kidnapped, raped and murdered Sarah Everard. He has now been sentenced to 19 months in jail. This is on top of his his whole life jail sentence for the murder of Miss Everard. We can listen to a section of what Mrs. Justice May told him in sentencing a short while ago.
For the offence against A, count 2 on indictment number T 2022-0638, the sentence is one of 19 months imprisonment. There will be concurrent sentences of 6 months on each of counts 2 and 3 on indictment T 2022-0320. The total sentence is accordingly one of 19 months. As I have already said, to the existing whole-of-life sentence from which the defendant will never be released.
Well, Mrs. Justice May talked about the fact that his pattern of behaviour had continued, and the fact that these cases of indecent exposure had not led to any police action. And she said the fact that no police came to find you can only have served to increase your belief in your ability to dominate women sexually without being caught. And she talked about the victims and how they have felt about this, how they have felt shock about the aggressive exposure, and how one of them has really felt enormous remorse that had she realised at the time what this man was capable of, and perhaps if the police had taken more action at the time, it would have meant that he would have been arrested at the time. This is important, of course, because Wayne Couzens, who's serving a whole life sentence for the murder of Miss Everard, was a serving Metropolitan Police officer at the time, and he carried out these offences that he has been found guilty for today. One of them happened when he was actually meant to be on duty. He was working from home. The other one happened when he used a credit card in his own name and would have been aware that his car would have had its number plate captured as he went to pay for fast food at a fast food restaurant and exposed himself to the woman who was working there. We can now talk to our correspondent, Matthew Thompson, who is at the Old Bailey for us. Matthew Thompson, he had pleaded guilty to these 3 charges, so he would be expecting a relatively hefty sentence, but this will just be added to his whole life jail sentence, won't it?
It will, yes. So it's 19 months in total for the 3 offences of indecent exposure. That breaks down as 19 months for the first offence, which took place in Woodlands in Kent in November of 2020, and then a subsequent 2 sentences of 6 months each for the later incidents, which were at the fast food restaurants in Kent in February of 2020. But all of those sentences are going to be served concurrently at the same time, which means a total, if you like, of 19 months in prison. Of course, in some ways that is academic, because as the judge made clear, Wayne Couzens is already serving a whole life sentence in prison in HMP Frankland in County Durham for the kidnap, rape and murder of Sarah Everard in 2021. And so he will die in prison whatever happens. But the judge was, I thought, very interesting on exactly why it was important that he be sentenced for those other crimes, even if it made no practical difference to the amount of time that he would spend in prison. She said it was first and foremost important for the administration of justice, for a public recognition that these crimes took place, but also for some form of restitution for the victims. And as well, she said, to recognise the bravery of the victims for coming forward. Without them, without their actions in coming forward, she said justice would not be served. So for all those reasons, even if it is slightly academic, the judge said it was very important that he be sentenced for those crimes. In terms of the facts of what happened, it was interesting to see them set out at some length. In terms of the first incident, which the judge deemed to be the most serious, Couzens was in Woodlands in Kent in November 2020. He stepped out as a passing lone female cyclist was passing by, completely naked, and began to pleasure himself in front of her. And she then reported it to police. She did actually pass his car as she was cycling off, but only had a partial remembrance of his licence plate. And so for that reason, the police said they were unable to progress the investigation any further. Then what happened in the February of 2021 was Mr. Couzens was using a drive-through at a fast food restaurant in Kent. He exposed himself to 2 female members of staff at the fast food restaurant. There is CCTV footage of Couzens' car with its license plate in full view. Also, he used his own credit card to pay for the food, and so the restaurant had a copy of the receipt with his credit card number. But that first incident on Valentine's Day, on the 14th of February, was not actually reported to police, not at least until 2 weeks later, when he did the same thing again. And again, there was CCTV footage. And again, he used the same credit card. So there was records of that. The following day, it was reported to police, and the fact that it was the same credit card as a similar incident that had happened 2 weeks before, but nothing was done. Couzens was not interviewed or contacted by police. And as we know, tragically, less than a week later, he went on to commit the rape, kidnap and murder of Sarah Everard. So this is, if you like, Couzens' potentially, unless new allegations emerge, of course, Couzens' last day in court. But what attention will now turn to is the extent to which there may have been options, possibilities for stopping him at some point. Had police investigated, for example, an incident that took place in Kent in 2015 when his number plate was taken? Had they investigated any of the incidents in November through to February 2021? Could they have stopped Couzens? Could they have done enough to at least get him suspended from his role as a police officer, which, as we know, tragically he used to then trick Sarah Everard into getting into his car? In fact, he arrested her, didn't he? So there are many options potentially for investigating what went wrong in the police investigations themselves. That is all, of course, the subject of a Home Office inquiry under Dame Angiolini, which is taking place as we speak. So that is where the attention will turn. We know now, of course, as we did even prior to today, that Wayne Couzens will spend the rest of his life in prison. But now, for important reasons explained by the judge, he's added to that another sentence of 19 months for several counts of indecent exposure.